Okay, Visualeconomik community, if I were to ask you why socialism has always failed when it's been put into practice, you will probably think of factors such as corruption, lack of innovation, the cumbersome bureaucracy, or the lack of incentives for citizens to work. However, there is one reason that is much more significant than all of them. You see, in 1920, Ludwig von Mises, one of the most influential economists in history, published an article in which he explained that a functioning socialist system would be literally impossible to achieve. Mises said this in 1920. That's long before the Soviet Union, and all socialist countries applied this model and failed miserably. Basically, this man predicted the fall of the Soviet Union 70 years before it happened. The question is, how could he have predicted it? Well, the answer lies in the theory of the impossibility of economic calculation. It's a theory that explains how, even if there is no corruption, even if there is no bureaucracy, and even if all the citizens work tirelessly, it will never be possible to design a socialist model that works. But to understand why, and to understand what this theory consists of in detail, let's look at it in parts.
From Marx to Stalin.
Karl Marx was the ideological father of the socialism that we all know today. Joseph Stalin, Fidel Castro, and Mao Zedong were inspired by him to carry out their communist revolutions. Yet, when Marx developed the ideas of modern socialism, he never really bothered too much to explain how his hypotheses were to be translated into practice. In reality, Marx was more of a kind of theoretical critic of capitalism, who never really thought about how to implement his theoretical approaches in real life. And so, when the socialist revolutions triumphed in the 20th century, red leaders like Stalin faced a huge problem. In other words, they managed to eliminate private property and put an end to capitalism. But from that point on, there was still a need to find ways to effectively plan the economy. They had to find a system for producing, distributing, and investing all the economic resources of a country. The question is, how did they do it? Well, among other things, with the well-known 5-year plans. The 5-year plans were a method by which politicians tried to organize the socialist economy in 5-year periods. These plans determined the production goals of the industries, the goods to be manufactured, which projects, investments were to be allocated to, and in general, where the country's productive resources were to go. For example, if political leaders felt that more steel needed to be produced, they increased the steel production target in the 5-year plan. And from there, the economy was organized to achieve it. That is, unlike what happens in capitalism, where a factory has to buy all of its materials, machines, and supplies, manufacture, and then sell. You could say that in socialist systems, everything was assigned directly by the government. It is the government that decides how much is produced, how it is produced, and who provides the necessary materials and supplies. Supplies that in turn come from other factories of the same government. And when the item has been produced, all the production is distributed according to what the government has established. In short, in these 5-year plans, everything was tightly spun. The economy of the whole country was organized from beginning to end by the politicians, and economic stability depended on the perfect fulfillment of these plans. So, what is the problem? Well, as you can imagine, the plans did not always work as predicted. Often the production targets were not met. Sometimes the working methods were not efficient at all, and sometimes not even enough materials arrived to get the factories up and running. After all, these plans were a bit like the butterfly effect. It only took one failure in the country's entire complex economic system for the production chain to collapse. But do you want a concrete example? Well, back in 1930, after a series of terrible collectivist policies and some natural problems, wheat production in Ukraine collapsed. Ukrainian farmers had difficulty paying their wheat dues to the government, and that put Stalin in trouble. Stalin needed the Ukrainian wheat in order to export it to other countries, and thus earn money with which to boost Soviet industry, which at the same time was the #1 priority of the 5-year plan. But obviously, if the Ukrainian wheat quotas did not arrive, Stalin would not get any money, and thus the industry plan could be seriously compromised. And how did the Soviet government react to this? It began abusively requisitioning Ukrainian wheat from the peasants, and even executed thousands of them for not submitting and facilitating these confiscations. In fact, the Soviet government even went so far as to requisition the grain that the peasants had saved as seed for future harvests. All of this resulted in an even more serious collapse of agricultural production, an enormous crisis that provoked one of the worst famines ever remembered, the Holodomor.
Honorable Comrade Stalin, is there any law of the Soviet government that states that villagers must starve? Why have we, the workers on collective farms, not had a slice of bread on our farm since 1st of January? How are we to build the economy of the socialist people if we are doomed to starve? What did we fall on the battlefront for? To starve? To watch our children suffer and die of starvation? Letter from Ukrainian peasants to Joseph Stalin during the Holodomor.
At the beginning of 1934, the Holodomor ended throughout Ukraine, and the result was that between 4 and 8 million people had died of starvation, all because of one tyrannical leader who wanted to enforce his economic plan no matter what. Human tragedy aside, what is important in all this is that the Holodomor was an example that the economic plans of socialist countries had enormous problems in being carried out. And right here is where Mises' impossibility in economic calculation comes in. According to Mises, it is impossible to organize a socialist economy from beginning to end without everything failing, or at least without the results being much worse than they would be in a capitalist economy. And we're not talking about the fact that planning socialism is very difficult. We're talking about the fact that it is literally impossible. The question is why? What makes socialism impossible according to Mises? Well, think about it. What is the first thing a socialist leader has to do to plan the economy? Certainly, to decide what things are to be produced and in what quantity. To do so, he or she should know what citizens want to consume, how much they will consume, and above all, what the limitations to their consumption desires are. That is, if everyone wants to have a sports car, the economy will not be able to produce sports cars for everyone. Resources are scarce, and the production of some goods must be prioritized over others. In a capitalist system, the way in which what is produced and how much is produced is prioritized is very simple. The key is the law of supply and demand and the pricing system. If consumers demand a product and are willing to pay a lot of money for it, the price of that product will go up. If the price goes up, companies will see a business opportunity in that product, so they will invest in new factories, increase production, and the problem is solved. Let's say that in capitalism, citizens' consumption preferences are reflected through trade and what they do with their money. They themselves are the ones who determine which products are most important. It does not have to be decided by a politician from an armchair. But take note, because this also applies to the best use of resources. For example, imagine that a car company is very efficient and manages to produce cars while using half as much steel as its competitors. Because it uses less steel, it has lower costs. And because it has lower costs, it can lower its prices. With lower prices, consumers will stop buying cars from less efficient competitors and they will go out of business. Conclusion? Through the desires of consumers to buy more cheaply, car production has been reorganized by the most efficient companies. Once again, it has not been necessary for a politician from an armchair to decide who, how, and when to produce cars, or how many cars to produce. All it took was for the price system to work. Basically, the whole organization of production in the capitalist system is based on prices. If the price of a product is very high, it is an indicator that more of that product needs to be produced, or that cheaper alternatives that can be produced more efficiently need to be sought. So what's the problem? The problem is that in socialist systems, prices do not exist, or at least do not exist in a generalized form and are not based on market criteria. So the question is, how can politicians know what the wishes of the citizens are if production output is decided from above? How can politicians know which companies are more efficient if they do not compete by means of price setting among themselves? How can they know in the face of a wheat shortage whether to produce more barley to compensate or to produce more corn? It's a real mess. A mess that is essentially impossible to overcome. On the one hand, because politicians are experts in almost nothing. If, for example, there is a shortage of oil, that is something that a businessman dedicated to oil will understand much better than a politician. But when politics is organized from above, it is the politician who decides, not the businessman. On the other hand, it is not only that politicians are not experts, but that countries are so large and economies so complex that the information that politicians would need to have to make the best production decisions would be so complex and unmanageable that it would be utopian to be able to collect and process it. Basically, they would have to be in everybody's mind in order to understand the preferences of the citizens, the real production capacities, grasp all of the accounting data of even the smallest company. And once all of this information was known, they would have to be able to predict the future in all economic aspects with enormous accuracy. Hence, the impossibility of economic calculation. That is, the impossibility of calculating what an economy should produce and how it should produce it in order to reach optimal economic levels. yours. But what if I told you that, according to some economists, artificial intelligence could put an end to the impossibility of economic calculation? Think about it. If the biggest problem of socialism is that politicians, with their limited intelligence and human knowledge, can neither understand nor calculate enough information about the production of a country, could a more advanced intelligence with super powerful data processing capabilities solve this problem? In fact, many argue that many companies are indeed already making these kind of calculations. Companies like Amazon already calculate what their consumers are going to demand in order to have products ready in the warehouses. Other companies such as YouTube read the minds of viewers using artificial intelligence and are able to offer them the videos that they are most likely to want, the ones that best suit their preferences. So, is it possible that with new technology, a functional socialism would be feasible? Could Mises' problem of economic calculation be overcome? Well, let's take a look.
Marx GPT?
First of all, let's make one thing clear. The future is unpredictable, and technology can deliver things that we can't even imagine today. Nevertheless, with what we know so far, the truth is that it seems quite unlikely that the problem we have just described will be solved thanks to artificial intelligence, and that is mainly due to 5 reasons. The first of these is that regardless of how developed artificial intelligence is, perhaps the most significant problem in economic calculation is the ability to obtain data. To some extent, obtaining company and production data would be reasonably straightforward. However, more abstract information data would be very difficult to obtain. For example, it would be complicated to get inside the minds of consumers and know what their preferences are. Sometimes we ourselves don't know which things we prefer, so it is unrealistic to think about articulating our desires to inform the government. At the same time, it would also be very difficult to obtain the information and knowledge that each worker or entrepreneur has in his or her head. After all, in every small company, in every small department, or even in every self-employed person, small decisions are made on a daily and continual basis. Decisions based on experience, intuition, or the response capacity of each company to the various problems that may arise. And in that case, the socialist artificial intelligence would need to have the same day-to-day knowledge and experience to make the optimal productive decisions. Things that, as you can see, it would not have. On top of all this, don't forget that as each person has very different interests and capabilities, AI should be able to detect even the best jobs for each person. So let me ask you, how could all the information, experiences, and capabilities of millions of human brains be collected? Well, unless ultra-advanced brain implants are invented, which are also cheap enough to reach everyone, it seems too complicated. Be that as it may, the second reason why AI could not make socialism successful is bureaucracy. In a sense, we could say that one of the main characteristics of functioning economies is that they can adapt quickly to change. When a small business person or worker makes a decision, he or she does not have to go through tedious political or administrative procedures, nor does that person have to wait for an order from above. The entrepreneur simply sees an opportunity and seizes it. And Visualeconomik viewers, experience tells us that when things are in the hands of governments, they are delayed to unanticipated limits, thus wrecking the economic potential of a country. The third reason, corruption and power incentives. No matter how much intelligence and how much data there is, one thing is clear. In socialist systems, it is the politicians and bureaucrats who have the upper hand. Corruption, populism, and even the ineptitude of the most powerful officials could sink the economy of any country, no matter how much a superintelligence would make the right decisions. In fact, all the information and all the analysis capacity that this supposed artificial intelligence planner would have could end up being used to do evil, to establish a tyranny. We've all seen the movies. It would not be the first time that good intentions have ended up creating barbarities. However, leaving aside political incentives, the private incentives are not much better. That is, assuming there is an artificial intelligence planning system that dictates production, that would mean accepting that each person should be engaged in the job dictated by that intelligence. Workers would have to accept wages set from above. They would not be able to undertake their own businesses and projects. And at the same time, given socialist ideals, there might not be much incentive to continually improve themselves. Evidently, all this would mean a loss of incentive to work, make an effort, or pursue continuous improvement. No matter how much intelligence would plan, the lack of competitive markets would not be able to extract the best from each person. And precisely in that sense, there is a fifth and final reason why socialism would still be very complicated despite artificial superintelligence. Here, we are talking about the lack of creative destruction. One of the characteristics of capitalism is competition between companies. Each company differs from the others, even in the smallest of details. Every company wants to be better than the rest, and it achieves this by offering better services than the competition. Yet, in socialism, all companies belong to the state. It is true that production incentive mechanisms can be established, but these incentives can be altered. A very common example of this is when the Soviet Union established production incentives for nail factories. Factory managers earned more money the more nails they produced. So what happened? They began to produce many nails, but of poorer quality. Nails that often could not even be used. So yes, intelligence could mandate production goals, but workers would never have the same incentives or the need to improve that is achieved by competition, and therefore innovation and any improvements would be much smaller than in a capitalist system. In any case, and at this point, it should be emphasized that this is just a matter of speculation. The future is uncertain. And as we always say, we don't have a crystal ball on Visualeconomik. We cannot know what technology will bring in the future, nor what possibilities it will offer. And that's why it is now your turn. Do you think that the problem of economic calculation could be solved with new technologies? Which argument convinced you the most? Can you think of other ideas for or against socialism planned by artificial intelligence? You can leave your answers in the comments. And now, if you like the video, like it, subscribe, hit the little bell, and we'll see you in the next one. See you soon.